Applause rose and fell around me like waves, loud enough to blur together, yet somehow incapable of filling the space beside my name. When I stood, smoothing the borrowed gown across my knees, my eyes did what they had always done in moments like this: they searched. Not out of hope exactly, but habit. One empty row stood out immediately, chairs untouched, programs folded the way they are when no one ever sat down. I knew then, before my name echoed through the hall, that no one in my family had come. I was 34 years old, a first-generation graduate, finishing a degree that took longer than planned and more from me than I ever admitted. This ceremony was not just a milestone, it was proof that the years I spent working nights, studying quietly, and choosing persistence over comfort had meant something. I told myself I didn't need witnesses. Still, absence has a sound of its own. I walked across the stage with a steady smile, accepting congratulations meant for a version of me that felt strangely unseen. There was no anger in that moment, only a dull, precise ache, the kind that settles rather than flares. I took my seat again, clapped for others, and let the noise move on without me. In my bag, beneath the folded program, was a sealed letter I had not yet opened. Its weight pressed softly against my side, as if reminding me that some silences are temporary, and truths arrive in time. I grew up in a family where usefulness mattered more than expression. We were practical people, trained by circumstance to measure worth in hours worked and bills paid, not in dreams articulated out loud. Feelings were private things, folded away like documents you might need someday but hoped never to pull out in public. From an early age, I understood that survival came first, and everything else was optional. Education, in that context, was tolerated rather than encouraged. School was something you did until it interfered with responsibility. Good grades earned nods, not praise. See you. Curiosity was fine as long as it didn't cost money or time. When I spoke about wanting more learning, more depth, more possibility, it was often met with silence, or a gentle reminder that wanting too much usually ended in disappointment. No one said I couldn't dream, they just never helped me imagine what it might look like. By my early 20s, responsibility had settled into my life with the quiet permanence of gravity. I worked nights, sometimes 2 jobs at once, learning how to stay awake on coffee and resolve. During the day, I took care of what needed taking care of: aging relatives, household gaps, the invisible labor that never earns a title. Money was always tight, never catastrophic but never generous. Every decision felt like a small negotiation between who I was and who I was allowed to be. Returning to school later than most was not a dramatic act of rebellion. It was a slow, careful decision made after years of postponement. I enrolled quietly, adjusted my schedule, and told almost no one. Classes were wedged between shifts and obligations, textbooks read under dim lights while the rest of the house slept. I learned to make progress without witnesses. It was easier that way. Over time, I became skilled at disappearing in plain sight. I did my work, met my deadlines, and kept my ambitions modest enough to avoid scrutiny. Praise made me uncomfortable, attention felt undeserved, even intrusive. I learned early that applause was unreliable, and I stopped waiting for it. Achievement became something private, measured internally rather than announced. It was during one of those long, unremarkable semesters that someone finally noticed. A professor lingered after class to ask about my research, asked questions no one else had thought to ask. Later, an email arrived, formal, precise, unexpectedly warm, acknowledging effort and depth I hadn't realized were visible. It felt unreal, like recognition meant for someone else. As graduation day drew closer, that feeling followed me. Hope crept in quietly, unwelcome but persistent, shadowed by a familiar dread. I thought often about how my family might see this moment, whether it would register as an accomplishment or simply another obligation completed. Invitations were sent without ceremony, mentioned once and never followed up. Part of me hoped their absence would hurt less if I anticipated it, if I treated this milestone the same way I treated everything else, with caution and low expectations. Still, as the date approached, the weight of possibility grew heavier. I told myself to focus on logistics, on schedules and robes and directions, anything practical enough to keep emotion at a distance. Yet beneath that discipline lived a quiet question I pretended not to hear: What would it mean if this time, someone showed up? That unanswered question followed me into the final weeks, settling beside my anticipation, making each step toward graduation feel both earned and uncertain. I carried it quietly. I didn't announce my graduation the way people usually do. There was no group message, no dramatic reveal. I mentioned it the same way I mentioned everything important in my life, carefully, casually, as if lowering my expectations might soften the outcome. I mailed invitations weeks in advance, choosing a simple design, nothing celebratory enough to feel like pressure. When I followed up, it was indirect. I worked it into conversation, mentioned the date while discussing schedules or errands, let the words sit there without insisting they be acknowledged. The responses were never cruel. That almost made them harder to name. "We'll see how things are that day," someone said, not unkindly. Another laughed and waved a hand. "It's just a ceremony. You already finished, didn't you?" The tone was practical, familiar, rooted in the same logic I had grown up with. Time off work was complicated. Travel was inconvenient. Life, as always, came first. I nodded through those conversations, smiled when appropriate, and reassured them, and myself, that I understood. I told myself attendance wasn't the point. I said the words easily because they were words I had practiced for years. Still, I noticed how other people talked about their families' plans, the certainty with which they spoke about who would be there, where they would sit, what they would wear. I listened more than I spoke. Comparison crept in quietly. As the day approached, communication thinned. No one asked about the schedule or parking. No one requested extra tickets. I resisted the urge to check in again, afraid that pushing would turn an absence into something more deliberate. I wanted them there, but I wanted it to be their choice. Presence, I believed, only meant something if it was voluntary. The morning of graduation arrived early and too still. I woke before my alarm, the kind of alertness that comes from nerves you refuse to acknowledge. I dressed slowly, checking my phone more often than I meant to. There was one last message I considered sending, something neutral, something light. Instead, I typed a brief note, "Heading there now, in case you're on the way," and watched it sit unread. I didn't wait for a reply. I told myself I already knew the answer. There was a strange calm in that acceptance, a practiced steadiness that felt almost like maturity. I finished getting ready, adjusted the collar of my shirt, and stepped outside with the careful composure of someone determined not to make the day heavier than it needed to be. During the drive, I rehearsed explanations no one had asked for. I reminded myself that people show support in different ways, that love doesn't always look like attendance. I repeated those thoughts until they sounded convincing. By the time I parked, I had folded my disappointment into something manageable, something small enough to carry without stumbling. I took my seat among the other graduates, surrounded by murmured conversations and the rustle of programs. I scanned the sea. Round once, then again, slower this time, letting my eyes pass over faces that belonged to other families. The realization settled without drama. There was no spike of anger, no rush of tears. Just a quiet confirmation of what I had been preparing for all along. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself this moment was mine regardless. I believed it, too, at least partially. What I didn't understand yet was how public absence carries a different weight, how being unseen in a room full of witnesses sharpens what you thought you had already accepted. When my name was called, and the space where my family should have been remained empty, that absence became visible. Not just to me, but to everyone. The ceremony marked the end of something visible, but most of what brought me there had happened far from any audience. Long before robes and programs, there were nights spent awake when the house was quiet enough to hear my own doubt. I studied after shifts that left my hands sore and my mind dulled, pushing through pages I sometimes read twice just to understand once. Progress came slowly, measured and finished assignments and small moments of clarity that felt almost private. There were risks I didn't talk about. Courses that stretched my confidence, research topics that demanded more than I was sure I could give. I chose them anyway, knowing that failure would be quiet too, unnoticed except by me. I learned to live with uncertainty, to keep moving without reassurance. Each semester asked a little more, and each time I answered without announcing it. Somewhere in the middle of that effort, recognition began forming without my knowledge. A professor encouraged me to submit work I thought unfinished. A recommendation was written without ceremony. Committees met in rooms I never entered, discussed my name without attaching a face to it. I was not present for those conversations, and I didn't know to imagine them. The letter arrived 3 days before graduation, slipped through mail like everything else in my life, quietly. The envelope was heavier than expected, the paper inside thick and formal. I recognized the letterhead immediately and felt something tighten before I even opened it. I read it once, then again, slower. It spoke of selection, of funding, of opportunity that extended beyond the degree I was about to receive. Words like distinction and promise appeared where I had learned not to expect them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The timing felt almost unkind. With the ceremony looming and my family's absence already settling into place, I didn't know where to put this information. Sharing it felt premature, almost boastful. Keeping it private felt safer, more consistent with who I had become. So I carried it with me, sealed, its weight noticeable whenever I shifted my bag. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully understand yet, proof that something meaningful had happened whether or not anyone witnessed it. Validation that existed independent of applause. I didn't reread the letter after that first night. I told myself there would be time later, after the ceremony, after expectations were met or missed. For now, it was enough to know it existed, that the years of quiet work had produced something tangible. It sat beside my folded program during graduation, unseen like so much else. After the ceremony, life resumed its familiar pace. Congratulations came from classmates, polite and brief. I packed away the gown, returned borrowed items, and stepped back into routine. The letter remained tucked away, waiting. It would have stayed there longer, perhaps indefinitely, if not for chance. One afternoon, searching for something else entirely, someone opened my bag and found it. The envelope surfaced without warning, and with it, the truth I hadn't yet learned how to share. The gathering happened the way most of ours did, unplanned, practical, shaped by convenience rather than intention. A weekend after noon, people coming and going, food laid out without ceremony. My graduation surfaced only briefly, mentioned in passing the way weather sometimes is, acknowledged, and then moved past. No one asked how it felt. No one apologized for not being there. I didn't expect them to. I sat at the edge of the room, listening, participating just enough to avoid attention. My bag rested near the door, where I had dropped it without thinking. At some point, someone needed space, moved things aside, opened it while searching for something else. The envelope surfaced that way, accidentally, without drama. My sibling picked it up, turned it over, and asked whose mail it was. I told them it was mine, intending nothing more than that. They nodded and slid a finger under the seal, casual, curious, unaware that they were crossing a line I hadn't known how to draw. I considered stopping them. I didn't. Something in me decided that if the words were going to exist, they could exist out loud. They read silently at first, eyes moving quickly, then slowing. The room continued its conversation for a moment longer, until the pause became noticeable. A sentence was reread. Then another. Finally, they cleared their throat and began reading aloud, not to announce anything, but because the weight of the words demanded sound. As the letter unfolded, the tone in the room shifted. Names of institutions carried a gravity no one could ignore. Numbers followed, funding amounts, duration, scope. The language was formal, precise, unmistakably serious. It spoke of selection among many, of opportunity extended forward, of a future not yet lived but already invested in. Each phrase landed differently than the last, recalibrating the room inch by inch. Someone interrupted once, asking if it was real. My sibling nodded and kept reading. Another asked why they hadn't heard about this. There was no answer yet. The letter finished in silence, the final line hanging longer than expected. No one reached for it when it was folded back up. No one laughed. I watched faces change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Disbelief came first, eyebrows lifted, glances exchanged. Then silence, the kind that settles when familiar assumptions no longer hold. Conversations that had filled the room minutes earlier now felt inappropriate, too small. My parents sat differently, as if the furniture had shifted beneath them. I didn't explain anything. I didn't fill the quiet with context or justification. I let the letter do what it had already done. For years, I had learned how to translate my choices into language they could accept. This time, the words were not mine, and that mattered. They carried an authority I had never been given. Questions followed eventually, tentative and uneven. How long had this been in motion? What did it mean? Where would it take me? I answered simply, without embellishment. I resisted the urge to defend the years that led there. There was no satisfaction in watching understanding arrive late, only a strange steadiness. What struck me most was not the praise, but the pause that preceded it. The recalibration. I saw my life being refiled in their minds, moments reassessed, decisions reframed. The absence at graduation remained, but it no longer defined the story. Something larger had replaced it, not loudly, but undeniably. Recognition arrived that afternoon without confrontation, without demand. It came through paper and ink, through truth that required no performance. The room eventually resumed its noise, but it was quieter now, reflective. And in that softened space, I understood that some truths don't need to be announced to be heard. After that afternoon, something shifted, though no one named it directly. Compliments arrived awkwardly, offered with the hesitation of people unsure how much enthusiasm was appropriate. Pride surfaced late, careful and tentative, as if it needed permission to exist. My parents spoke differently to me, not louder or softer, just with a pause they hadn't used before. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it wasn't dismissal either. There were moments of quiet regret that appeared unexpectedly. A comment about the ceremony, a mention of the day they should have been there, said without drama and without expectation of response. I let those moments pass as they came. I didn't rush to reassure them or correct the past. I had learned that some acknowledgments lose their meaning when forced into neat resolutions. What surprised me was how validation felt when it arrived late. It didn't surge or settle dramatically. It didn't erase anything. Instead, it clarified. It confirmed what I had already begun to accept, that my work had always been real, whether it was witnessed or not. Their recognition added weight, but it wasn't the foundation. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I was careful not to turn the moment into leverage. There was no satisfaction in reminding them of missed chances or unasked questions. I answered what they asked, shared what felt natural, and kept the rest private. Composure came easily because I no longer needed the outcome to justify the effort. The years behind me had already done that. Emotion surfaced quietly, later, when I was alone. Not anger or triumph, but release. The kind that loosens something held too long. I sat with it without rushing to define it, allowing the feeling to pass through without spectacle. Dignity, I realized, often looks like restraint. In the weeks that followed, relationships adjusted in small, nearly invisible ways. More listening. Fewer assumptions. Space where there hadn't been any before. Time moved forward, reshaping us without announcement, teaching us how to stand differently in one another's presence. After the letter was read, the house did not erupt into speeches or tears. Conversation resumed, but in a lower register, as if everyone had instinctively agreed to be more careful. Compliments arrived awkwardly. Someone said they were proud of me, then immediately redirected the conversation. Another mentioned the opportunity with caution, as though speaking too directly might diminish it. Pride appeared late, tentative and unsure where it belonged, carrying none of the ease it might have had if it had arrived sooner. My parents moved differently around me in the days that followed. They asked questions they had never thought to ask before, paused before offering advice, listened without interrupting. There was no formal apology, no emotional confession. Instead, there were softened postures and quieter voices, an unspoken acknowledgement that something important had been overlooked. Once, my mother mentioned the graduation itself. I should have been there, she said plainly, without drama or explanation. I nodded. We both understood that nothing more needed to be said. I paid close attention to how validation felt when it came after the moment had passed. It didn't surge like relief or erase the memory of empty chairs. It settled slowly, clarifying rather than comforting. Their recognition did not create my sense of worth, it merely acknowledged something that had already existed. That difference mattered. It allowed me to accept their words without leaning on them. I refused to weaponize the moment. There was no satisfaction in listing the years of effort they hadn't seen or the messages that went unanswered. I didn't need to defend my choices anymore. When praise came, I received it calmly. When hesitation lingered, I allowed it. Dignity, I realized, often meant letting others arrive at understanding in their own time. The emotional release came privately, later, when I was alone. Something eased that I hadn't known I was still holding. Not triumph, not resentment, just a quiet exhale. I let it pass without naming it or sharing it. As weeks turned into months, the shift continued subtly. Conversations grew deeper. Assumptions softened. Respect replaced dismissal without announcement. Time moved forward, reshaping our relationships gently, proving that change does not always arrive loudly, but it does arrive. In the months that followed, the subtle changes in our home became more apparent. Conversations lingered longer, questions were met with attentive ears rather than automatic responses, and assumptions I had once taken for granted began to dissolve. Misunderstandings that had hardened over years softened, not through force or confrontation, but through quiet awareness. Listening replaced interruption, and the space between us felt less rigid, more willing to accommodate difference and growth. The patterns of dismissal that had always punctuated our interactions now appeared less frequently, replaced with pauses that suggested thoughtfulness rather than indifference. I stepped into my next chapter with a steadier sense of self. Career opportunities, independent projects, and further studies all unfolded alongside a private confidence cultivated long before anyone else acknowledged it. The validation from others, belated as it was, never became my measure of worth. I had earned recognition silently, steadily, through nights of unseen work and years of perseverance. I understood, finally, that the absence at my graduation had been less about my achievement and more about limitations imposed by circumstance, habit, and perspective. Their absence could not diminish what I had accomplished. Recognition, I realized, mattered in its place, but self-respect mattered more. True dignity is neither gifted nor taken, it is quietly built through resilience, patience, and integrity. The applause of others is a welcome echo, not the foundation of accomplishment. And when understanding comes late, it still has the power to reshape relationships, but it cannot redefine the person who has already carried themselves through the work with quiet grace. Some measure the value of presence by attendance or acknowledgement, but I measure it by the constancy of effort and the strength of character that persists even when unseen. The years of solitude, diligence, and self-reliance had carried me here, and they continue to carry me forward. They missed my graduation, but they didn't miss who I became.